1.896 million soldiers. That is how many Russian lives Putin's Donbas ambition will consume if nothing changes. 1.896 million soldiers, dead or grievously wounded, before the last square kilometer of Donetsk falls to Russian control. That figure is not a projection invented to shock you. It is the arithmetic of the battlefield itself, drawn from Russia's own confirmed casualty rate on the ground right now. 316 soldiers lost for every single square kilometer captured in Donetsk. That is the price tag. And there are still roughly 6,000 square kilometers left to take. Here is the brutal irony. 2026 was supposed to be the year Russia finished the job. The Kremlin told the world that the Donbas would fall this year. Putin ordered his generals to deliver it. He even issued a deadline: the Donbas captured by September. And to back that ultimatum up, Russia launched what it intended to be the defining offensive of the entire war, flooding the front with assault waves on a scale not seen since the opening months of the invasion. It is not working. It is spectacularly, catastrophically not working. And the numbers prove it in a way that no amount of Kremlin propaganda can paper over. In this video, we are going to look at exactly why Russia's spring offensive in Donetsk is collapsing under its own weight, how Ukraine has engineered one of the most lethal defensive systems in modern warfare, what the battlefield math tells us about Putin's September deadline, and why that deadline is already dead, and what comes next as Ukraine begins setting the conditions for a future that Russia never planned for. But first, let's look at what Russia actually achieved in Donetsk in April, because the numbers are the foundation of everything that follows. April is the month that exposes the lie at the heart of Putin's Donbas offensive. Russia does not just fail to advance in April. Russia goes backwards. According to analysis from the Institute for the Study of War, Russian forces record a net loss of 116 square kilometers across the entire theater in April. That is the single largest net territorial loss Russia has suffered since August of 2024, and it arrives at the precise moment when Russia is throwing more at the front than it has in months. Think about what that means. Russia escalates. Russia attacks harder, more often, with more men. And Russia ends the month with less territory than it started with. This is not a fluke. It is a trend that has been building for months, and the trajectory is unmistakable. In January, Russia gains 318 square kilometers. In February, 122. In March, a barely breathing net gain of 23. In April, minus 116. Add the 4 months together and you get Russia gaining just 348 square kilometers across an entire third of a year. For context, that is an area smaller than many mid-sized cities. For that, Russia is spending tens of thousands of soldiers every single month. Here is where it gets serious. Putin stands in front of his generals and sets a deadline: the Donbas by September 2026. He has already told Ukraine to withdraw its forces from the region by the end of May or face the full wrath of the Russian military. That wrath, measured in territory, amounts to less than 1 square kilometer per day across the entire Eastern Front. Ukraine does not withdraw. Russia does not deliver wrath. What Russia delivers is a trend line pointing straight down. The math makes September 2026 an impossibility. Ukraine's own military analysts note that at the pace Russia was moving in January and February, which was already far faster than it moves now, it would take a year and a half to complete the capture of Donetsk. A year and a half from March puts the Donbas falling, in Russia's best-case scenario, somewhere in the autumn of 2027. That is more than a year past Putin's deadline, and that was the optimistic projection. The one built on January's numbers before the spring offensive started failing. Until now, Russia could at least point to momentum. It could claim that the grind, however costly, was still moving in one direction. April ends that claim. The momentum has broken, and Ukraine built the machine that broke it. To understand what Ukraine has constructed in the Donbas, you have to go back 12 years, 2014. Putin annexes Crimea and ignites the first phase of his war against Ukraine. The Donbas begins burning. And even then, even in the chaos of those early months, Ukraine starts to understand something that will define its entire defensive strategy a decade later. The Donbas is not just a piece of territory. It is a fortress waiting to be built. Ukraine starts building it. 12 years of fortification, 12 years of rivers turned into obstacles, minefields laid in overlapping belts, tank barriers sunk into the earth, bunkers constructed to survive direct artillery strikes, and kill zones designed and redesigned around the specific threat of Russian assault doctrine. The result is what military analysts now call the Donetsk fortress belt, and Russia has been shattering itself against it ever since February 2022. Here is the thing about the fortress belt that Russia keeps failing to account for. It is not a static line, it is a layered system. Russia does not just have to break through a trench line. Russia has to break through an interlocking architecture of mutual support, where the fall of one position simply exposes the attacker to fire from three others. The fortress belt is designed so that every advance costs Russia more than the advance is worth, and that design is working precisely as Ukraine intended. The key node in this system right now is Sloviansk. Sloviansk sits at the heart of the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk corridor, and capturing it would give Russia a genuine lever to shift the strategic balance in Donetsk. Russia knows this. Putin's generals know this. They are throwing assault after assault at the approaches to Sloviansk, and the approaches are eating them alive. In the single week leading up to April 27th, Russia launches 1,384 combat assaults across Ukraine. 1 week. That works out to nearly 200 attacks every single day. In the Pokrovsk sector alone, Russia mounts 305 assaults. In the Huliai Pole sector, 147. These are not probing actions. These are full commitment ground assaults, each one costing Russia men, vehicles, and ammunition. And this 2-month high in attack numbers coincides exactly with the month Russia loses more ground than it has in over a year. The math is telling you something. Russia is scaling its effort, and the returns are going negative. Let's zoom in on what is actually happening on the ground, because the picture at the tactical level reveals exactly why Russia's strategic ambitions are collapsing. Take Kostiantynivka, a settlement west of Chasiv Yar. Russia's plan is to bypass it, to flow around it, and use it to flank the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk region from multiple directions simultaneously. Clean, efficient, classic Russian encirclement doctrine. Except Ukraine does not allow it to be bypassed. Ukrainian forces hold positions that make any attempt to go around Kostiantynivka an invitation to be annihilated in the open. So Russia finds itself in a trap of its own making. It cannot go around, so it has to go through. Head on, directly into prepared Ukrainian defenses. The result, as analysts tracking the sector describe it, is Russian assault infantry literally covering the approaches to Kostiantynivka with their own bodies in frontal attacks that are slow, exhausting, and catastrophically expensive in blood. This is not an isolated case. It is the pattern repeating itself across Donetsk. Russia tries to flank. Ukraine denies the flank. Russia is forced into a direct assault. The direct assault grinds forward at enormous cost. And then Ukraine cancels out the gain somewhere else on the front. The canal near Chasiv Yar is crossed. Russia achieves some flanking pressure there. It captures a handful of small villages in the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk region. These are real gains. Russia's propagandists celebrate them. But they are not enough. They are never enough. Because Ukraine is simultaneously reclaiming ground elsewhere, and the arithmetic of exchange, soldiers spent versus kilometers gained, is moving catastrophically against Russia with every week that passes. Stay with us because it gets worse for Putin. Pokrovsk. Russia fights for 2 years to take this city. 2 years of grinding attritional combat for a single Ukrainian city. Russia finally claims the city center in January. The northern portion falls in March. These are real, tangible Russian victories, and they matter. But here is what they cost. In just the 6 months leading up to February, Russia loses 15,000 soldiers in the Korb sector alone. One sector of defense, one city. 15,000. And when Pokrovsk finally falls, Russia's plan is to push on to Belitska and then use Dobropilya as yet another flanking lever against the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk region from the west. Ukraine has a plan for that too. It is called the February counteroffensive. Ukraine recaptures more than 400 square kilometers of territory in its southern regions. That territory was Russia's buffer zone, the land it held to prevent Ukraine from redirecting forces into Donetsk. When the buffer disappears, Russia scrambles. The reserves meant for the Pokrovsk push get diverted south. No reserves mean slower assaults. Slower assaults mean fewer gains. Fewer gains mean the September deadline gets further away with every passing week. This is the strategic genius of Ukraine's active defense. Every gain Ukraine makes anywhere on the front has a multiplier effect on Russia's capacity in Donetsk. Russia is not fighting one battle. It is fighting everywhere simultaneously with finite resources that are running out faster than they can be replaced. Now let's talk about the weapon that is changing the arithmetic of this war more than any other. Drones. Ukraine is now deploying 30% more strike drones than Russia across multiple sectors of the front, including Donetsk. 30% more. And this is not just a numbers game. The quality of Ukraine's drone systems is at parity with Russia's, and in some categories, it has surpassed them. Ukraine's own military leadership describes the shift as a very significant leap forward, not incremental progress, but a fundamental change in the drone balance of the war. Think about what that means for the fortress belt. Russia's assault doctrine depends on massed infantry advancing under the cover of artillery and electronic warfare. Drones shred that doctrine. A drone does not care about artillery suppression. A drone does not care about the size of the unit advancing. A drone finds the unit, identifies the highest value target, and eliminates it. And when Ukraine is flying 30% more of them than Russia, the kill zones that Russia must cross to reach the fortress belt become something approaching impassable. Here's the strategic logic that Ukraine is now executing with precision. It is not enough to stop Russia at the fortress belt. The goal is to destroy Russia before it ever reaches the fortress belt. Kill the supply columns 30 kilometers behind the line. Kill the command posts 60 kilometers back. Kill the logistics networks that sustain the assault troops. Make the entire Russian rear and occupied Donetsk a kill zone extending 100 kilometers deep. Ukraine's middle-range drones can strike exactly that deep. 100 kilometers behind the front lines. Transport routes on the Donetsk Ring Road. Supply hubs in Horlivka, Andriivka, and Zhuras. Every drone strike on a supply column is a direct attack on Russia's ability to sustain its assault tempo in the Donetsk. Fewer supplies reaching the front means fewer assaults. Fewer assaults means fewer casualties for Ukraine. And each disrupted Russian advance means Russia's casualty rate per square kilometer keeps climbing. 316 soldiers per square kilometer. That number is not fixed. It is going up. And Ukraine's drone campaign is designed specifically to push it higher. Compare this to Kursk. In August 2024, Ukraine launches its counter-invasion of Russian territory. At that point, Russia holds a significant advantage on the strike drone front. Russia has more of them, more operators, better developed production pipelines. And still, Ukraine crosses the border and holds Russian territory for months, forcing Russia to divert forces away from the Donetsk front to defend its own soil. Now flip the script. Ukraine is the one with the drone advantage. The implications for Russia and Donetsk are not encouraging. And here's the cost-exchange ratio that Russia cannot survive. Between December 2025 and April 2026, 5 months, Russia loses 156,735 soldiers, confirmed. Tracked individually by Ukraine's Army of Drones system. Not estimated, not projected, logged, and Russia is not replacing what it loses. It is over 8,000 soldiers short of covering those 5 months of losses in recruitment alone. Every month that passes, Russia's ground force in Donetsk gets a little smaller, a little weaker, a little more hollowed out by the mathematics of attrition. This is where Russia's two choices both lead to disaster. Russia can slow its assault tempo, preserve its units, reduce the daily casualty rate. But slower assaults mean less ground gained. Less ground gained means the September deadline, already a fantasy, becomes a humiliation. The Donbas does not fall. Putin's ultimatum is exposed as empty. The West stops believing that Russia can win, and the pressure on Ukraine to make concessions evaporates. Or Russia can maintain the assault tempo. Keep the attack waves going, keep the pressure up. But with a shrinking pool of soldiers, maintaining that tempo means using smaller units per assault. Smaller units die faster in prepared Ukrainian defenses. The casualty rate per square kilometer goes up. 1.896 million soldiers becomes a floor, not a ceiling. And Russia bleeds itself dry on a battlefield it cannot exit without political catastrophe. Either path leads Russia to the same place, a death trap of its own construction. But there is a third dimension to what Ukraine is building in the Donbas, and it is the one that Russia's planners clearly never modeled. The fortress belt is not a defensive line, it is a closing jaw. Ukraine's strategy is not simply to hold the fortress belt and absorb Russian attacks until the war ends in a negotiated stalemate. The strategy is to use the fortress belt as the anvil against which Russia hammers itself to pieces. And then, when Russia's offensive capacity is sufficiently degraded, to use the ground Ukraine has reclaimed and the drone advantage Ukraine now holds to drive the hammer back. Ukraine's February counteroffensive in the south is not a sideshow. It is the preview. Ukraine proves that it can take back 400 square kilometers in a single operation. It proves that Russia's rear is not secure. It proves that every kilometer Russia holds requires soldiers to defend it. Soldiers Russia needs in Donetsk? This is strategic pressure in the classical sense. Ukraine is not just fighting for the front, it is fighting for the entire board. Middle-range drone strikes deep into Donetsk are part of this strategy. They are not symbolic, they are systemic. When supply lines along the Donetsk ring road are hit, the frontline assault infantry in the fortress belt's kill zones go without resupply. When command posts in Horlivka and Zurich are struck, coordination between Russian assault groups degrades. When logistics hubs burn, the material pipeline that feeds Russia's attack capacity shrinks. The front does not collapse overnight, but it grows weaker. Every week, every drone strike, every disrupted convoy. The Jamestown Foundation's analysis of Ukraine's drone reach makes this concrete. 100 kilometers of penetration. Russia has no effective counter to these systems across occupied Donetsk. Its air defense resources are already committed to protecting higher priority targets. The drones that Ukraine is flying into the Russian rear in Donetsk are hitting targets that Russia simply cannot protect. Here's what that means at scale. Russia is not just losing soldiers on the front line. It is losing the infrastructure that makes sustained offensive operations possible. Fuel, ammunition, replacement vehicles, command continuity, medical evacuation. All of it is being degraded by a drone campaign that Russia cannot stop, cannot match in numbers, and cannot outmaneuver with doctrine that was designed for a different era of warfare. Russia planned for a war where it could mass forces, suppress defenses with artillery, and advance behind a wall of firepower. That war does not exist in Donetsk anymore. Ukraine has replaced it with something Russia's military theorists never modeled: a three-dimensional kill zone, extending 100 kilometers deep in every direction, run by a country that is producing and deploying drones faster than Russia can destroy them. Russia built its trap for a version of Ukraine that no longer exists. Here is where the Donbas situation arrives at its two possible endings, and both of them are bad for Putin. In the first scenario, Russia persists. It continues the assault waves. It absorbs the casualty rate. It pushes into the fortress belt and eventually, at enormous cost, begins to make progress through it. Maybe it takes 2 years. Maybe it takes 3. Maybe the casualty count reaches 500,000. Maybe it reaches more. But suppose, for the sake of argument, that Russia wins this scenario. Suppose the Donbas falls. What does Russia win? It wins a devastated region defended by an adversary that has spent years learning exactly how to destroy Russian ground forces at scale. It wins a country that now leads the world in operational drone warfare doctrine. It wins a front line that stretches even further and must now be held by an army that just spent its offensive capacity purchasing the Donbas one body at a time. Ukraine does not stop. Ukraine has not stopped for 4 years. Ukraine will not stop because the Donbas fell. It will counterattack. And Russia, having destroyed the core of its ground assault capability on the Donetsk fortress belt, will be in a profoundly weaker position to defend what it holds. The Pyrrhic calculation is brutal. Russia can win the Donbas and lose the war. In the second scenario, Ukraine's attrition strategy works completely. Russia's assault waves break on the fortress belt often enough and expensively enough that the offensive capacity degrades below the threshold needed to sustain meaningful advances. The September deadline passes. The year-and-a-half projection passes. Diplomatic pressure on Ukraine to concede the Donbas erodes because Russia demonstrably cannot take it. And Ukraine? Having rebuilt its own strength on the back of the drone advantage and the strategic depth created by middle range strikes, begins the conditions for a pushback into occupied Donetsk. That push is not imminent. Ukraine does not claim it is imminent. The Donbas is not going to be liberated in the next 6 months. But the architecture Ukraine is building, the kill zones, the drone advantage, the deep strikes on Russian logistics, the active defense operations that reclaim territory and force Russian reserves away from Donetsk, all of it is pointed in one direction: forward. Eventually, the summer will tell us a great deal about which of these scenarios is closer to reality. Russia's spring offensive continues. The assault tempo has not yet broken. Putin is still issuing orders from Moscow, but the battlefield math is speaking louder than any order Putin can give. 156,735 confirmed Russian losses in 5 months, a net territorial loss in April for the first time in nearly 2 years. 316 soldiers spent per square kilometer in Donetsk, a drone balance that has flipped in Ukraine's favor, a fortress belt that has stood for 12 years and is standing still. Russia is not winning the Donbass. Russia is bleeding itself dry trying to take it. And the more it tries, the harder it fails. Putin planned his Donbas offensive for a world in which Ukraine was a victim. Ukraine refused to be one. And the bill for that miscalculation is now being paid in Russian lives on a scale that will define this war's outcome long before September 2026 ever arrives. The fortress belt still stands, and it is taking everything Russia has left to give. If you found value in this analysis, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.